Hi folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter, and in this episode I just wanted to respond to a couple new videos from some YouTubers on their fresh discovery of R.A. Lafferty. An account called Literally Books, not Literally Books, which is what I thought it was at first. It's Literally Books. It's a good title. Made a video about their first reading of Past Master, and kind of just discovering R.A. Lafferty, having not read any before. And then in response to that video, another account, Liminal Spaces, sought out some Lafferty and engaged a handful of short stories from Lafferty. And both encounters from each of them were very positive and very, very interesting, very fresh. And so I want to take a moment to interact with them. They're worth interacting with, and direct you guys over to see their responses to encountering Lafferty for the first time. And as I was thinking through responding to this, it really brought up some insights and speculations about burgeoning Lafferty readership, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit as well. So this video is a little bit variegated, but there is kind of a structure to it, so let me give you an idea of where this is going. I'll react to each of those videos in turn, and in so doing I will say a few new things about Past Master, which is what we're going through on the channel right now, and also a smattering of Lafferty's short stories that I believe most of them I have at least mentioned on here before, but we'll say a little more about them. So there's some fresh new Lafferty content here just in interacting with those videos, and that's kind of the first half of the video. In the second half, the main Lafferty content I'll look at in that portion is the Promantia from Lafferty's book The Devil is Dead, which is a sort of prologue. Kind of in interaction with, strangely enough, this is what came to mind, some things that C.S. Lewis said in regard to George MacDonald, to older writers, about myth and the way myth works. And I was finding these interesting resonances between what's happening with readership of Lafferty, and ending the whole thing with almost a plea, but really more of a wish for more diversity in Lafferty readership, and I'll explain what I mean when we get to that part. But I am very excited, about what is kind of happening online on YouTube with Lafferty readership. Just a little bit of a sort of network of interactions happening between YouTubers about Lafferty, kind of forming a brainweave or mind weave for those familiar with Lafferty's book Fourth Mansions, we might say. Hopefully not as sinister. So as I said, not only are these videos on Lafferty, but they're about first encounters with Lafferty from some people who are long-time science fiction readers and reviewers who have definitely heard the name Lafferty, but are just now seeing anything of his in print. And it really made an impression. So to begin with, a guy called Virgil from Literally Books got on to Lafferty and actually wanting to try to track him down and read something from Gene Wolfe, as a number of people do, because Gene Wolfe has written about him several times, imitated him once or twice by Wolfe's own, sort of self-confession. But in this case, and this is something I'd never heard about Wolfe, but maybe I had seen that Wolfe mentioned Lafferty in an interview or two, but apparently in this interview that he was being asked what he's reading that he likes, and he mentioned Lafferty, and that piqued Virgil's interest. So what he got a hold of was the audiobook of Past Master that came out not too long ago. And Virgil didn't talk about his impression of that reading or that audiobook at all, which I would have been interested in, because I did listen to it back when it came out, and I felt very mixed about it, both in terms of the person chosen to read and the nature of reading out loud a book like that. And I have read myself, I have sort of read some short stories and stuff to my children in the past out loud from Lafferty, and generally speaking found that to be quite an incredible experience, and brings even more out of his fiction reading it out loud. But in the case of Past Master, I wasn't totally sure it worked, and I was going to give it a second listen and have never gotten around to that, so I should do that at some point. But regardless, it totally worked for Virgil, because I don't know if he went and also read it or not, but I think that was his main access to the novel, or first access, and it made a huge impression on him. And because that was on his mind, probably the very first thing he noticed, he said, was that Wolfe's writing sounded very Laffertian. It was like, whoa, Wolfe is obviously influenced by Lafferty, he felt. He even said, my initial thought was this prose sounds kind of wolfish, but of course he realized the influence would be the other way, Lafferty preceding Woolf just by a little bit. And we'll get into a few things he said, more particularly about the comparison between Woolf and Lafferty. But one of the main things he focuses on is the space travel in the novel, which is really just a segment toward the beginning, but where they go into what the novel calls hop equation space. And it's maybe a sort of hyperspace or hyperspace adjacent sort of idea. And it was largely the discussion of that aspect of the novel that piqued Chris is the guy from Liminal Spaces that piqued Chris's interest. But one of the things I love about hearing from other readers, new readers or old, I suppose, but just hearing them discuss Lafferty, is what stands out to them, and is it what stands out to me, and that kind of thing. And this has always stood out to me, this whole hop equation space, the way the pilots experience sort of 5 years worth of dreams in a 1 month period, and they're 90 seconds long each, and you get a few examples of the dreams in that sequence and some general ideas about sort of mental debris preserved out there in space. And so there's a resonance there between our readings. But he also reminded me of something that I forgot about, because that's one of the things about this that we'll see as we're going through our chapter by chapter. In Lafferty's deceivingly simple style sometimes, there are so many little details packed into each paragraph, and there's no way you can remember it all, and certainly not all at once. And one of the things I haven't really thought about for a while is that it says that people who are well-adjusted, as the novel says, can't do hop equation space. It drives them crazy. Can't do the procedure or go through it, the medium or whatever it is. Those who are maladjusted can. And Virgil summed this up as those who are insane can do hop equation space and those who are sane can't. And that's not the exact language that Lafferty's novel uses, but there's definitely something about being mental health or state of mind or what have you, being adjusted or maladjusted. You gotta be a bit maladjusted to do this hop equation space, which is so cool. And we can get more into that some other time. But it was here that Virgil found a certain parallel with Woolf, in that these dream sequences and things going on in that segment of the novel, give a cascade of imagery, some of which, as he put it, is precognitive of characters and things that will happen later in the novel. Also calling back to things that had happened just before, but yeah, there's definitely sort of a awareness of people and things that transcends or breaks or punctures our normal experience of space and time. As the novel itself puts it, when you're just about to get into this section on hop equation flight, it breaks here. It isn't like other space, and persons and things in it aren't the same persons and things they were before. And one of the things that Virgil talks about here as well is the sort of gender or sex reversal that happens in hop equation space to the pilots and passengers. And here we get into a possible interpretive issue, because the way Virgil read it, he understood it to be saying that on the trip out, let's say, on the trip in one direction, the pilots and passengers, genders or sex, it's not entirely clear, are reversed completely right through, and they go wherever they go and get off the ship and everything, and are that other gender or sex, and stay that way until they take the flight back, or the flight in the other direction, and then their gender or sex reverses back. And because he was reading it that way, in his mind that meant when Thomas takes his one-way trip in the novel from Earth over to Astro, once he's been brought forward in time, his gender is reversed, and then he just stays that way for the rest of the novel. And the novel says nothing about it and seems to do nothing with it, which he found extremely strange and kind of bizarre and intriguing, as you would. Now, I had to go back and look at it to be sure, but I can't see that it indicates that at all. The language to me looks pretty clearly to be saying that gender or sex is reversed whilst in hop equation space, and reversed back once you come out of it. However, there might be some semantic wriggle room there. Wriggle room? Wiggle room? Wriggle room. It's wiggle room, but I'm going to say wriggle room. Mr. Wriggles. As to what's being said about that reversal. So I'd be very interested to hear what other readers think about that. But as I say, like in works by writers like Gene Wolfe, there's so much detail that it's it's easy to either get a little confused about some of these details and or find that like, oh wait, we saw these differently and there might be room for different interpretations here. So he's that kind of writer, and that was something that Virgil very much noticed, that in the same way that Woolf's works invite and reward rereadings, in order to catch what's going on, he found that to be the case with reading Past Master. And this is something I've been saying for a while on this channel, so it's so cool to hear somebody else confirm that, a longtime reader of Woolf, who's first encountering Lafferty, going, whoa, there's various similarities, one of which is this rereading quality, because so much is going on. So very cool. Be curious to see, if that comparison continues to take hold and be a way of encountering and grappling with Lafferty, and whether there's other opinions about that. And interestingly, again, in that whole thing about, remembering and misremembering and being reminded of details, he noted that when Paul, the pilot who's sent out to retrieve Thomas More from the past, when Paul tells more about Astrobe, the planet Astrobe, and how it's a utopia based on Thomas More's book, the way Virgil put it was that Thomas More is like, yeah, you're not the first person from Astrobe to come talk to me about this. I've heard all about Astrobe. And my thought was like, no. He just says, I've seen people from the future before. You're not the first person to come talk to me from the future, which is funny enough and weird enough, because that was, this aspect of things really struck Virgil, like, oh my gosh. But in this case, when I went and looked at the details, I was like, wait a sec. That actually is pretty much exactly what Thomas More is saying. I do think it's kind of revealed in a slightly more circumlocutionary way than Virgil's kind of punchy summary of it, which is partly why I didn't remember it that way. But his summary is correct, I think. So again, what do you think of this aspect if you look at the details there? Has More actually heard of Astrobe before? And I think I'm convinced he has now. So it's cool. It's just great to have some real reader interaction about these things. And I'm sure as we go chapter by chapter through it, we're going to get into tons of fun stuff like that, just like they do on these various Gene Wolfe podcasts that go into detail chapter by chapter. And maybe I won't be the one to do it. I have to say I'm not good at like managing these kinds of things, but if anybody wants to set up Discord or subreddit or what have you around talking about Lafferty generally, and could get into Past Master specifically, and whatever else comes up, as people have done with Woolf and lots of authors. The main ones I know about are Woolf and Cormac McCarthy. Yeah, I would definitely participate in that, but I don't know if Lafferty's readership is big enough yet for that still, after all these years. I was on some forums like way back when, and it was just a handful of people. So we'll see. So another main thing that Virgil got out of this initial reading of Past Master, which is another parallel with Woolf, was Lafferty's Catholic symbology really suffusing the novel. And Virgil notes that while he doesn't think there's any, as he put it, crusading going on in Lafferty's book, there is a lot of religious symbolism. And one of the things, a couple things he really presses into on that I haven't thought much about, that definitely occurred to me in past readings, but I mean, my mind didn't chase them up hardly at all. One being that the person sent to get Thomas More, his name is Paul. And he only has the one name Paul because he's an outlaw, and your surname is taken away from you if you are involved in irregular doings. And Virgil felt there was a very strong connection to the Apostle Paul there, which when I've seen Lafferty do things like that, I've felt that it was just meant to be sort of a simple, kind of quick resonance with things like that, but that you're not really meant to look for proper allegory or even proper sort of allusion or intertextuality there. Well, intertextuality definitely, but more of in terms of sort of flavor and texture rather than hardcore content and theme and so on. But as he outlined what he thought about that, and I'll leave you to go watch it, I was definitely intrigued and kind of like, yeah, I think there's more to this than I have really thought about so far, and quite possibly way more. And so that's another fun thing about readership growing with Lafferty, is like there's going to be a lot of things that are sitting there in potentia in his fiction that is going to become actualized in various ways as various people look at it and bring things to it, which happens with any fiction, but more so with quite, dense fiction as Lafferty's is. But of course, dense but super fun. Lafferty's strange that way because he's very parallel to Woolf in that density, but I don't hear a lot of people walking away from Woolf going, that was so fun, what a riot, and that kind of thing. I do think they're having fun and getting a lot of pleasure out of it, and they do express that, but there's a little more playful outrageousness in Lafferty, or a lot more, that makes all that density feel a little different than in something like Woolf. And it kind of has pros and cons. I mean, I think they're all pros, but like initial sort of cons in that you might not notice how dense it is because it was so seemingly silly or fun or funny and crazy, quote unquote. And also to the degree that you actually see that there's like layers here and resonances, they're just harder to tease out because they're put in such a raucous, fun, funny way. But for me, that's ultimately a positive. The other thing Virgil says in regard to the religious symbology is that he sees a very strong Christ allegory or resonance in the person of Thomas More. And I've certainly noticed that in the past. And that definitely, stronger than the Paul thing, I've definitely always noticed that. And I see that little bit of tracery in there. And it is very like Gene Wolfe with Severian and possibly other characters like Silk and what have you. That there are Christ-like figures, and this is what Wolfe himself says, rather than being an actual Christ figure, there's someone like Severian is Christ-like. And I can see that with Thomas More. But again, I think I thought the resonance was a little lighter than it feels Virgil is taking it. And now I'm wanting to think more closely about that. Like, yeah, I think Virgil's onto something here. I think it's a little deeper than I was realizing, because it does kind of follow some of the plot points, quote unquote, of like the New Testament Gospels. But then as in Woolf with Severian or something, it's like, so what does that mean then? Why have this Christ-like figure in the person of doubting Thomas? Not the doubting Thomas of the New Testament, but they call him that, and one character kind of confuses him with the doubting Thomas of the New Testament, who was one of the disciples of Jesus, who didn't initially believe in his resurrection. But this Thomas More has kind of given up on his faith when they bring him into the novel. It says he believes in the mornings for a little bit. I always love that line. It's something I could always resonate with. And his death does bring about this incredible change. But it's not a crucifixion. I guess it is a government execution, so it is like the crucifixion in that. And I don't think there's a resurrection, though there are potential sort of parallels, and there's a really weird scene there about him potentially having some kind of afterlife or something. It's very strange, and I've never understood it. And I've always wondered if there's a Christ figure in there who's not Thomas More. So we'll get to that. But Virgil notes generally that, as he puts it, it's such a well-written story and tight. This is his word. He says it's really intelligent and tight. Love that. And that speaks to something I've been trying to get to. I've talked a lot about how I feel that the novel is choppy, and Lafferty called it choppy, and these densities and layers and, things that make it a bumpy ride in certain ways. And that a lot of people have felt maybe sprawls. And even Virgil, I think, acknowledged that things seem to be kind of put in there and then not much is done with them, and maybe they don't have as much to do with the central plot, if at all. And other people have noted that. And yet it struck him as a tight read. And I do think it still has that quality. And part of that is, as I've said before, Lafferty's concision of prose that he can use a lot, though he can also be quite lyrical. And also that his novels tend to be short. A lot of people would have padded this out with more exposition and exhibition, really. And because Lafferty doesn't do that, it does give it a certain kind of tight quality. And lastly on that, as I've been trying to say, I do think a lot of these things that seem like they're just careening off almost for fun, which would be an okay thing in itself, but so much of that actually does tie in and cohere on a certain level. And I think that contributes to that sense of tightness as well. So I'm pretty sure that's the only time I've ever heard somebody describe one of Lafferty's novels as tight, intelligent and tight. I really like that. And I don't know for sure what Virgil means by that, so maybe we'll hear more about that. But that's very worth putting in there and becoming part of how we read Lafferty, and a consideration there. And probably my favorite thing that he does here is he really tries to press into the reading experience as in regard to Lafferty in particular, in this novel in particular, and the difficulty of naming this particular oddity of the experience as he talks about it. And as he puts it, it feels at times that you, the reader, are more invested in a scene than either the characters or the narrator. And his example of that is just that opening chapter where these three men who are sort of the top leaders on Astrobe are met together and just having this semi-philosophical conversation about who to pick for their next world president, who will help right the ship of utopia. And all during that, there are these mechanical killers attacking the building that they're in and slowly like killing the guards and tearing down the walls and eventually get in the room and all this. And they just keep calmly having their conversation. It's quite funny and farcical, but also odd, you know, because you're like, they, and to some degree the narration, are treating this in a way that is unexpected, that we're like, no, this, so they should be having this conversation and really worried about this attack whilst having the conversation, etc. So we as the readers are concerned about that, but they're not. You know, he says, as he thought about it, it does seem right that these men would actually behave that way, but it was unexpected. And I don't know, I like that thought. It's like, you know, imagining, I don't know, Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk all met together in a room to decide on some big global thing, and rioters or whatever are outside trying to attack their place, and they're just like, yeah, we're fine. Because in the scenario, two of the mechanical killers are not after two of them. They're only after one out of the three. So two don't have to be worried. And the one who is says, this is one of my own buildings. I know secret ways out of this, so it's no big deal. And I can just picture like known heavy hitters in our world being kind of similar. You know, at a certain level of privilege, you don't have to worry about the same things as other people do, even what would be life-threatening for other people. So in that way, this is how Lafferty smuggles in aspects of realism through farce and stuff. But Virgil notes that what he's calling a sort of detachment there in the narration, I guess, that produces a unique effect that's hard to name, and that he, again, was reminded of Woolf, that Woolf has something of that detachment. And that is something I've heard people say a lot about Woolf, and I certainly experienced that as well. In a way, I then later learned of feelings of more attachment in the narration and different things in Woolf, but initially it can seem, well, this is the interesting thing to me. I think there's a huge difference between Woolf and Lafferty on that point of similarity, and that is that, if we want to call it detachment, Woolf's detachment can be frankly cold. And again, I've heard people use this word about Woolf, whereas Lafferty's is warm. And it comes across in weird ways, because in this scene, actually, the portions that punctuate the long conversations that describe the mechanical killers doing their thing are, first of all, in italics, which gives them a certain kind of emphasis. But secondly, the narrator starts getting into this, like, kind of, who's the sailor from Tintin? Captain Haddock, I think. They're like, blistering barnacles! Like, the narrator starts talking like that, which is not unusual in Lafferty. And he comes across more like a carnival barker pointing to the action. And this is how there is, like, it's very involved. It's not detached. It's like, he's like shouting at the reader about this. Almost like in lieu of, like, to counterbalance these three men's lack of concern. But it's so silly and so fun that it does have that same effect of being like, this is inappropriate. This is not how you should be evoking the terror and destruction of these mechanical killers breaking into this place. And so it still gives that feel. And like I say, it's almost like a carnival barker going, step right up, check out the crazy action, you know. And so it's like thunder, thumping thunder outside, the screaming of maniac machines, you know, and it's like exclamation points at the end of each of those sentences. Howling, undermining, and a section of one of the outside walls beginning to slide, you know, that kind of stuff. In between them going, well, it can't be Plato, because Plato was too, he was, you know, he was a programmed person himself, and never mind that he wrote the program, and, you know, all these kinds of things. And in fact, these three men do acknowledge a little bit here and there the noise and the what have you, but they are still unconcerned. And not all of those italicized portions are shouting in that way, using either that language or exclamation points, but they are kind of vividly describing the action and go in and out of kind of that carnival barker bit. So it's another sort of point of interpretation at the level of like the reading experience that I would be curious to see how others felt about that, whether they agree or disagree with what Virgil's trying to say there. But he's definitely getting onto something that is just so important in reading Lafferty and discussing him. There are many, many, many moments and aspects like this that create these strange reading effects that are just very hard to put your finger on, but you know something is happening there that's unusual and sort of disorienting and dislocating in a quite intriguing way. Yeah, in one way I think Woolf and Lafferty are different sort of in tone or something like that when they have this quote-unquote detachment or something about the whole narration that it creates a weird almost dissonance or something between reader and events. I don't know what to call Woolf's exactly, but in Lafferty I think a good word for it is it's deadpan. It fits in with the tall tale tradition and stuff, and that's a lot of how he creates that effect. Is he's just delivering this deadpan, like this is ridiculous, this is crazy, but I'm not going to smile, but you can feel the wink like in the air between us without my face giving anything away, without my narrational voice necessarily giving anything away. Though other times he will use the narrational voice to be silly and be like, ha, and he kind of goes back and forth. And Virgil, talks a bit about some of the utopian, dystopian aspects of the novel, which are interesting and you should look at. Drawing a parallel from Thomas More's Utopia, that there was like an open door policy that you could go into any building or house that you wanted to Lafferty's, ratcheting up of that, as Lafferty does, it's like an open mind policy. Anybody can go into your mind and even sometimes make you say things and stuff. And that the people living in the slums of Cathead and so on are there voluntarily and could any moment go back to the utopian cities and be completely cared for, but they choose this sort of self-exile, as Matt from Bookpilled called it, in regard to Past Master. And Virgil notes that idea of like self-exile from utopia permeates Past Master, the book, and that's a very good point. And a lot of people just never even mention this whole slum type thing that is one of the most fascinating things about the book, because it's unusual. You normally in a dystopia you see the deprivation and squalid conditions or whatever it may be, those who are being oppressed through some aspect of utopia, and so that there are privileged and unprivileged peoples within utopia. There's always like a cost to the goods of utopia. In this case, like apparently, in terms of material needs, it really is all there and for everybody. But people are choosing not to have those material goods and live in this horrible material conditions that we'll get into as we're going through chapter by chapter. But all in all, Virgil says that it was just a rewarding rabbit hole to fall down, and that's great. That's so exciting, so fun. And he ends with a great quote from Past Master and just says, quotes this line from the book: "Golden astrobe, it blows out souls like rows of candles." Very great thing to end on there, very interesting. And one thing I feel very happy and somewhat vindicated about is that this proves my point, that people are still discovering Lafferty for the very first time through his novels rather than his short stories, and becoming hooked through the novels, which people still are continuing to say are inferior to the short stories. The short stories work because Lafferty's absurdity and quote-unquote surrealism works at that short length, and that whole approach to writing fiction doesn't work at longer length for Lafferty. Some people say this, and that's just not everybody's experience of reading Lafferty. There are challenges to that longer form and sustaining that weirdness at the longer form, but there are also massive rewards and some things you can't even get from the short fiction. Yeah, so it's cool to see that Virgil wants to be on the lookout for more now that he's encountered Past Master. And both Virgil and Chris from Liminal Spaces noted that once they were like locking onto Lafferty and looking around, they looked on their bookshelves, and they've got huge bookshelves full of science fiction from various eras, but a ton from the 60s and 70s, and they're just like, I haven't got a single volume of Lafferty on my shelf. And then of course they're looking around and going, oh, it's all out of print and what have you. But it's so interesting that even people in the know will have heard Lafferty's name, but that's just it. That's all it amounts to. And then they discover him, they're like, how have I not read this before? It's a very strange thing with Lafferty. And in regard to some of the differences between the short stories and novels in Lafferty, one of the things that Virgil said in the comments was that he found Past Master to be kind of like SF magical realism, and I've talked a bit about Lafferty being magical realism adjacent on this channel. And one of the main impressions that Chris from Liminal Spaces got from the short stories was the presence of the tall tale mode, which I've also talked a lot about on this channel. And that tall tale mode is very evident in the novel once you think about it. And it even contains an actual tall tale in it, like it says, there's tall tales floating out in space. Here's one. It's so great. But there is, again, sort of a difference in texture between the short stories and novels often in that regard, to where you could easily ascribe magical realism to the short stories and tall tale to the novels. However, you would probably be more likely to do it the other way around, I think. And there's something about the sustained narrative in a long form for Lafferty that, whilst it may contain elements of tall tale, it just doesn't have an overall feel of tall tale. It's something, more appropriate to a longer form, like maybe magical realism. Not that magical realism can't be done in short stories, of course it can. But, I've never heard of a tall tale novel. That is a, short story form. So anyway, just a thought about possible differences between short stories and novels in Lafferty. So, as a transition from Virgil at Literally Books talking about Past Master to Chris at Liminal Spaces talking about some short stories by Lafferty, I was fascinated to see that they both had a certain kind of approach. Chris more so than Virgil, but both did this. They wanted to narrate their story of discovering Lafferty step by step and what led them to it and what their impressions were and where they went from there. And this is something you see again and again with Lafferty readership. Now, of course, this is true of most works of art and artists and so on that are really special, that either, acquire a cult following or maybe a much larger following, but a sort of devotion. People will want to tell their stories of here's how I discovered this person, this artist, step by step. But you don't do that with everybody. It is kind of more certain artists that garner that kind of reaction, and Lafferty is one of those. But I really think Lafferty might be uniquely so. I mean, there's probably some other authors like Lafferty, but kind of an even smaller subset there that just draws that out of people because it's such an experience. It's such an event. It goes beyond normal artistic consumption. There's something so strange and unexpected about it, about the work itself, about how have I not heard of this, and all these different things that make people, just in order to make sense of this strange literary phenomenon, to go, well, let me just tell you my story of how I discovered this, And they both did that. And in fact, there was a volume of Feast of Laughter, which is a sort of academic journal zine that is put out by Lafferty fans, where they had a whole section on lightning essays, as they called them, that were people telling their stories of how they encountered Lafferty, and I even wrote one in there. It's in volume 4 of Feast of Laughter. So Chris at Liminal Spaces saw Virgil's video and was like, I got to get into Lafferty. And Chris's response to Virgil, just his continued reference to that, is really quite humorous. His almost baffled impression and whoa. And it really shaped his search through Lafferty's work because it created certain expectations. And this, I'll talk some more about this. This is something all the time with Lafferty. You hear about it, it creates expectations, and then you encounter it, and yeah. So the first story he discovered is Ghost in the Corn Crib, and I was very jealous of him having an actual physical copy of the book that's collected in an anthology called Haunt of Horror from Marvel Comics, I think, back in the 70s. And the initial thing he says about this is he goes, I was shocked because it was not what I expected. So he was expecting to be shocked, to be wowed, to be like, whoa, this is so strange. But this was nothing like what he expected. And this is something I talk about in my recent Ubik video, because I'm making some Patreon content, some bonus free stuff available here on YouTube, and that's the first one. And I talk a bit there about the difference between cool weird and uncool weird. And Dick is more like cool weird, and Lafferty is definitely uncool weird. Cool, I guess, there in a sense of sort of hip. Not exactly, but when you experience Lafferty, it's definitely strange and weird, but it doesn't fit with what you normally think of with strange and weird, and can have qualities that you wouldn't normally associate with anything like that, such as that tall tale quality. That might be wild and crazy or whatever, but it's not anything really anybody's using in a really weird way to infuse their fiction with a strangeness that's really unusual. But it was cool that he immediately recognized that quality of Lafferty, and he had a personal connection to it in that he says he grew up in a small town in Utah, the Southwest, which is Lafferty's region or overlaps with Lafferty's region. And one of the things I tried to demonstrate to a degree in my PhD on Lafferty was that he is an American regional writer of the West, Southwest, the Great Plains, that area. And among the many ways we can place and think about Lafferty, I think we can very much think about him alongside the Cormac McCarthys and the Willa Cathers and N. Scott Momaday and so on. Though, as I'll get into at some point, his evocation of the West, of the Great Plains, is really quite different than most other writers who do it in quite an epic way, and Lafferty's more about oddity and detail and that kind of thing. So yeah, he said it reminded him actually of growing up in Utah and hearing stories like this. And he said it also reminded him of that series from back then, or that book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. You know, and that frame of reference, that's not universal either in the States or elsewhere. And I've certainly experienced here in the UK that anyone I seem to have asked about or brought up the whole idea of tall tales and these sorts of things here, people are like, you know, maybe they've heard the phrase, but they don't know what it means, and certainly not the American iteration of it, though most people will have heard of Paul Bunyan or seen a statue of him in some American production or something, but it could easily, you know, pass you by and you not really know what it's all about. But I literally grew up with being taught tall tales in the curriculum, you know, in school in the sort of 80s mainly. And I don't know if that's still the case in the US. But one thing that's really interesting about that is a connection to a lot of other things going on in US literature and art, including up to today, because it does connect him to people like Cormac McCarthy, who is not always immediately seen, does involve sort of American Southwest humor, which is linked to things like tall tales, and other people who may do that sort of thing. But also, and that's just something I've thought for a long time, but to like filmmakers like the Coen brothers, they have a ton of that distinctly Western humor in their films and so on that involves like a level of uncomfortable violence put across in a comedic way that increases the discomfort and that kind of thing. That's total Lafferty, man. And just a lot of strange juxtapositions and unexpected narrative turns and inclusion of the weird, even the paranormal perhaps from time to time, and the sort of allusions to and layerings with maybe myth or whatever, like in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou and stuff like that. But also like, you know, spin-offs from the Coen brothers, like the Fargo TV show, I've been thinking for a while, is very, very Laffertian, and again involves whether it's alien visitations and UFOs or overt science fictional stories woven into the mundane story about robots exploring space or something, or various sort of paranormal phenomena included in an otherwise realistic, if exaggerated and comedically violent, and also not comedically violent, you know, show. And I think Lafferty's fiction has a very strong connection to that kind of thing, like the Fargo TV show. And for that matter, another bonus content from Patreon that's up now is my little chat about the TV show Reservation Dogs, which is made by Native American writers and producers and actors and so on, and has, you know, Lafferty has a strong flavor of that Native American sort of humor and worldview and stuff, more than I would say they're Laffertian, but strong connections there. But that's the kind of thing we're talking about here when we bring up tall tales with Lafferty and stuff. It connects to a lot of things going on, and I can't recommend Reservation Dogs highly enough. Go watch it. But of course, this story, Ghost in the Corn Crib, didn't meet Chris's expectations at all based on that review of Past Master by Virgil. So he's like, well, he was just looking for one story to talk about for a video on his channel. He's like, well, let me look for another one. Because he whilst he didn't have any Lafferty on his shelves in terms of an individual book, he found that he did have some of the anthologies that Lafferty was collected in. So that was one. And then he found another one, Judith Merrill's SF-12, that includes the primary education of the Cameroy. And so he talks a bit about that story. And he does note, like, okay, this story is very different than Ghost in the Corn Crib. So Lafferty definitely does different things. And I love the way he just takes his time and kind of slowly goes through some bits of that story. And I love that about both of these guys. It's so cool to see. They really take their time and use Lafferty as he's meant to be used. And I'm going to get into this at the end when I talk about the Promantia from The Devil is Dead. But where you take these little pieces that he puts in there and you can just look at them and contemplate them and let them expand out in your imagination, because Lafferty doesn't do that. Lafferty doesn't spend a lot of writerly time kind of playing it all out. He puts it there, and what he puts there is so golden, so good, that it's dense in and of itself, these little ideas that you can just contemplate it for a moment and let it just expand in your mind. And they do that with bits here. And so he does some things with the aspects of that story, and I'll leave you to go watch it. But ultimately he says that he thinks it's an exercise in, as he says, how weird it would be to look at a concept that two alien species share, but of course would not be really the same between the two species, and in this case that's education. And whilst I knew that was something of what was going on in the story, I've never really thought much about this story, and I've always been more blown away with the course lists at the end and the crazy things that they study and do upward from there through the grades. And he does talk about that, and it's great. But I've not thought much about this like incommensurability between ideas of education between whole different planets. And as Samuel Delany put it in his introduction to the story, The Primary Education of the Cameroi and the Best of R.A. Lafferty, the primary education of the Cameroi is, among other things, a story about linguistic drift as human society spreads more and more widely over more and more diverse landscapes. And of course, that's something of great interest to Delany himself, and some of his major 60s science fiction novels are about that very thing. So he's going to clock that in Lafferty. But it's a good reminder to me of how Lafferty really does speak into some of the key going SF speculative themes and ideas and interests, even though his approach is just so odd and so different than is usual in SF. And sometimes I think just goes right outside of SF concerns to a degree. And when Virgil talks about the portion of the story that mentions that, maybe content warning, this is kind of a weird thing to just say, but like that they hang children when, they just can't be brought into line in terms of their curriculum and stuff. The way it's delivered is such a great little dialogue delivery there. I mean, as this happened actually several times in both videos, as they like either quoted or summed up some things from Lafferty's fiction, I laughed out loud afresh, just totally surprised, not remembering the sort of punchline or what have you. It just like reminded of how funny Lafferty is in a very uncomfortable way oftentimes, as in this case where like one person says, we hang them, and a person from Earth in disbelief says, "Literally?" And he replies, "How would you hang someone figuratively?" And of course, in terms of defamation and whatnot, you might think of how you can do that figuratively, but it's a great comedic moment. And Virgil just notes how this, as he puts it, insane humor just is peppered throughout all the stuff he read from Lafferty. And it reminded him of hearing older or elderly people tell stories in, say, the Southwest growing up or what have you, where, as he said, sometimes they will be telling a story and just drop in the wildest, craziest stuff that kind of blows you away like that. And it's a good reminder that, all the wild stuff, some of us might be looking for is not always found in newer things. It could be in older things or older people. And I definitely can remember some of that kind of thing sometimes from older people telling stories. And I should add my usual sort of caveat about terms like insane and crazy and so on that get used so much with Lafferty, because it's very hard to think of some alternate terminology, and maybe I hope we'll be able to a degree, just acknowledging there's issues around how we talk about mental health and stuff, but acknowledging that, what we mean by saying that it's insane humor or whatever is not meaning to make sort of mental health issues this othered thing, I guess. And so he clearly enjoyed that story and was very intrigued by it, but he was like, I still need to find the story I'm going to cover for my video on this channel. I don't think I've found it yet. So he pulls down another volume, a collection that has Lafferty's story, and All the Skies Are Full of Fish. Now this was so cool, man. People have been talking about the primary education of Cameroi and stories like Slow Tuesday Night and Thus We Frustrate Charlemagne and Narrow Valley, 900 Grandmothers, Land of the Great Horses. Almost all of this stuff is in his initial collection, 900 Grandmothers, for a long, long time as examples of Lafferty's stuff. And people just generally, the public discussion just generally never gets out into the weeds with Lafferty, where some of his weirdest and best stuff can be found. And this was always one of my favorite stories by Lafferty, and All the Skies Are Full of Fish. And again, just watch him go through the details of the story and kind of retell it himself. It's lovely and wonderful and funny and wild. And he notes at this point, he's like, because he's telling his journey, as I have said that people do with Lafferty. And he's like, every story I read was better than the last. And you can literally trace that out through the 5 stories he reads. And he does literally go from, in my estimation, it literally goes up and up and up. Like, this would be the least good, though very good, and then onward up to this is clearly the best story in exact order for me. And when you're discovering Lafferty story by story, this is typically how it goes. Very few people land on the story that is going to sell them straight away into, like, I need to read everything by this author. And that's partly because of what's available. And as I say, I think some of the better stuff basically is not what's widely available or widely talked about. So it's going to take a minute to get to that stuff. And also, this is so important, I'll talk more about this in a minute, Lafferty wrote quite a diversity of stories, even though there's so much that makes them all so clearly by the same author, and a lot of repeated tropes and themes and so on. But there's such a diversity that different stories hit different readers very, very differently. And typically, a lot of us, there'll be groupings of people who all have the favorite story or set of stories, and then whole different groupings that have whole different favorites, but also just individuals that will widely diverge on what they think is the best and even the worst of Lafferty. So typically it takes a handful of stories where almost inevitably, whatever you read first, you will go, okay, I'm a little intrigued. Hopefully enough to go on and look for some more, but I have found that that's not always the case, because I think people run into, stories that especially just don't fit the hype. They're like, why does he have a cult following based on just reading this XYZ short story that didn't really hit me? But for those who do get into him, it is typical that you'll have read one and been like, okay. And you kind of keep your eye out for that name, and then you hit another and you're like, okay, this is consistently strange and a little bit different each time. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I'm like more officially locked in at this point. And then, 3, 4, 5 stories down the way, you go, okay, yep, I'm into this. I need to keep exploring this. And typically there will be like one main story that like is the one that grabs you. And at this point, I never can remember exactly which one it was for me out of probably a handful that I discovered around the same time. And I'm like, which was the one that like I went, oh my God, I got to read all of this. I can't even for sure remember. And one of the things that happens in this story, and All the Skies Are Full of Fish, as the title might suggest, is that these kids, there's 2 competing gangs of kids, and one pull down gentle rains and the other pull down crazy stuff out of the sky from like the prehistoric past, like flora and fauna or something, fossils of flora and fauna. And they call down fish out of the sky to have a fish fry, but the fish they call down are like giant prehistoric fish. But again, that connection to things like Coen Brothers and this Fargo TV show, fish falling out of the sky, is kind of a Fortean thing. Charles Fort and stuff like that. That happens in an episode in Fargo, and things like that. So again, there's that kind of connection in certain sort of American, often Western types of storytelling that will involve these kinds of strange things. Lafferty's in that vein. Now, something really interesting that Chris notes here is that he felt that each story he read, as he puts it, had no point and were absolutely incredible. And as he said, there's just no deep reads or interpretations necessary, as he put it. Though you can do that, but it's just not necessary. It's just like coming at you full. This is just a strange experience that doesn't seem to necessarily have a point, but it makes a huge impact. And, Chris notes that he loves, literarily picking things apart like that and doing deep reads, but he felt that Lafferty's stories seemed to resist that, he says. And that's so cool. And in a lot of ways, that's absolutely true, and one of the best things about his work. On the other hand, they only resist that initially. as he then just like demonstrates, because he proceeds to like off the cuff just land upon this pretty profound interpretation of that story, and all the skies are full of fish. And I'll leave you to go see what he says about it. But as he's saying it, he's like, whoa, because he's kind of like, I guess you could say, and then he's like, actually, now that I say that, I like that interpretation. But he points out that he says that didn't come to me at the time of reading, and that he'd have to go back and see if there's textual evidence for this idea and stuff. But that is what I've called Lafferty always kind of having these depth charges in his fiction that kind of detonate later, or you could say seeds that grow slowly. And that reminds me of something that the actor and comedian Bill Hader said some time ago about Lafferty, talking about 900 Grandmothers, that collection being one of his favorite books. And he said at that time, even if the story doesn't totally cohere, you feel like it's about something. And that was something we were all saying, I remember, in those earlier forums and stuff, going like, you can tell there's something going on here, something deeper. There is some kind of meaning or point to it, but beats me what it is. And it's so cool about Lafferty. To me, it's kind of a mythic resonance that he has in his fiction. And that's really part of the joy of it. Is it's quite exciting to experience a piece of art that just goes, here is some pretty hefty meaning that gives you like that buzz that deeper meanings can give you, but totally impenetrable at first. You're just like, I don't know, but I'm getting that feel that like, whoa, there's something going on here. And I'll just go ahead and tell you what else Bill Hader says. That's so great. That I used to quote all the time and haven't thought of for a while. And he connects it again to region, okay? Because Bill Hader is from Tulsa, like Lafferty, and that's part of why he connected to this fiction in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as he says, you feel like it's about something. He says, it's so incredibly Tulsa. You get that feeling when you see a Flaming Lips show. It's not like we're dark and hurt and twisted. It's like, I've got blood on my face. Come on, y'all, this is awesome. Because they're an Oklahoma band as well. And Bill is referring to some of their stage antics and stuff, and fake blood on the face and stuff like that. And I really think Bill Hader's exactly right. It's like, that's how it is in Lafferty. All this kind of dark and often bloody sort of qualities to his fiction. But he's laughing and we're laughing whilst this stuff is going on. And there is more of a sense of like, this isn't all dark and twisted. It's awesome. And I definitely think both of these reactions picked up on that quality if they didn't necessarily name it as such. So at this point, Chris was going to maybe just talk about And All the Skies Were Full of Fish for his channel, but decided to dip in one more time and found in Brian Aldiss's collection, Galactic Empires, Lafferty's story, Been a Long, Long Time. Oh man, I just can't believe it's so cool to see people like on the internet talking about obscure Lafferty stuff like this. Like, this is one of Lafferty's very, very, very best stories. It should have been included in the Best of Lafferty. And there's really nothing comparable to it in that Best of collection that gives you a clue that Lafferty can do this kind of stuff too. And it's one of the more important kinds of things that he does that should be spread as representative of him. And it's like mixing the comic and the cosmic, and people have said there are similarities to Calvino's Cosmic Comics, which I haven't really read yet. I've dipped into, and I did see resonances with Lafferty. And I will just leave you to looking at his summary of this. Brilliant, just love it. So good. The universe just expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting while an angel sits with a room full of monkeys trying to type out the complete works of Shakespeare. It's so great. But at this point, he finally goes, okay, I've hit it. I've found something from Lafferty that is really weird and kind of lives up to my expectations based on having heard that review on Past Master. That's how Chris feels at this point. So he's going to we'll just do it on Been a Long, Long Time. However, he was reminded that he'd been recommended a Lafferty story in a comment previously, because apparently one of the main things he liked, I just discovered these channels, so I'm just getting to know their content. But apparently on Liminal Spaces, Chris, I guess it's Chris and his brother that do the videos, but Chris in particular apparently likes to look at things about the unconscious and dreams and things, and particularly stories about dream machines that explore this. And somebody had said, hey, there's a Lafferty story that involves a dream machine and the unconscious and stuff that you should check out. And he was reminded of this, and he's like, okay, let me go find that. And it was the story, Configuration of the North Shore. And now I'm just so super happy. You have no idea. That is possibly my favorite story by Lafferty. It's certainly in my top 10. It was for a long time the story that I loaned to people who had never read Lafferty, and I'm just like, here's a good starting place. Just try this. And it came out in Orbit 5, the Orbit series by Damon Knight. And incidentally, that is on the Internet Archive. If you type in Orbit 5 on the search on Internet Archive, it's the whole book. I like Internet Archives like photocopies of books. They're crisp and clean and quite a nice way to read stuff electronically if you have to, because it still gives a little of that feel of the physical book. So you can go read that story there, and it's well worth your time. There was later a collection called Lafferty in Orbit that took all those stories that Damon Knight collected and put them into one volume. And this collection has always kind of bummed me out, because in terms of content, in terms of the stories included, it's some of Lafferty's very best stuff. And it's finally like a collection that actually represents some of the best of what he can do, so much better than almost any other collection. But unfortunately, it was put out very sloppily, to be honest, by an independent press. And I appreciate that they put it out, but it's so riddled with typos that it's just distracting, and it's just not what Lafferty deserves. And I've always had a hard time recommending it, because I'm just like, you shouldn't encounter Lafferty in such a poor format with all these typos and stuff. He deserves better than that. It should be really clean and well put together. So I'd be curious if people have encountered Lafferty through Lafferty in Orbit and found that a good reading experience in spite of all the typos. And this used to be widely available, though now I think it's become yet another one of these that's like prohibitively expensive. So I don't really necessarily recommend that you try to read the story from here. Just go look at it on Orbit 5. Also, the thing that I always loaned out to people, which is currently loaned out actually to my daughter, so I can't show you the physical copy, is Gardner Dozois's collection, Modern Classics of Fantasy, which has a lot of other great stories in it, so it's worth getting by other authors. It's worth getting for that reason. But it has Lafferty's Configuration of the North Shore with a nice intro by Dozois. But it just looks really good on the page, and it's a great way to encounter that story. And what Chris said was that Lafferty's story here, Configuration of the North Shore, looks at liminality in a way that is closest to home that I've ever seen. That's what Chris says. And this is something that's dear to him, so that's quite a statement. And as he said, he's like, this is kind of the Lafferty story for this channel. And that's cool that those two things found each other. And because this is something that Chris thinks about a lot, he immediately had kind of an interpretation of this story where he says that, I think this concept of the North Shore, Go look at his description of it. It's really good. But it's a man and his analyst using this shadow booth dream machine sort of thing to kind of assemble and follow his dreams, where he's trying to find this elusive North Shore that clearly represents something important, and these like weird precursor dreams each time that he has to go through. It's such a good story. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you. I guess maybe manage your expectations, because like I said, it's always different than what you're thinking it's going to be. But it displays Lafferty's penchant for storytelling, as in like stories within stories, and the weirdness of them and the left turns that they take. And again, it exhibits what I always call Lafferty's dream punk mode, which is very akin to things going on in Past Master. So there's a strong connection between a story like this and Past Master. But what Chris says about this story is that I think this concept of the North Shore is inside all of us, but it's not called the North Shore. As he goes on, there's a magical place deep in our subconscious. There's this place that is just ours, but it's so hard to find. It's like practically impossible to get to. And even in your dreams, you're just continuously almost there. So this is what Chris says about it. And he just locked into it. He's absolutely spot on. I've always felt that way about the story, although again, it's one, despite being one of my favorites, I haven't tried even in my own mind to articulate much about, and I think he articulates it really well here. And it could go on to be explored. Because there's interesting things there too about where I think it's speaking to exteriority as well as interiority, which is something Lafferty is constantly doing, and again, I think is a major theme of Past Master. And it reminded me that this is why I from time to time will say that something Lafferty writes is poignant or moving. I really need to think of some different vocabulary. I say poignant too much. But yeah, it can kind of touch the heart in both awe and hard to name emotions. And he does so in a way, again, not as maybe mainstream or traditional or literary fiction might do it, with like slowly building up the sort of plot and character qualities and stuff will kind of touch your heartstrings and these sorts of things. You know, it's in a different way that I don't really know how to describe at the moment. But Lafferty sort of creates these strange scenarios that will suddenly surprise you with doing that same kind of work that you might have gotten out of a different kind of fiction, where you find basically your soul kind of stirred by something Lafferty is writing. And it's so cool that Chris picked up on that. And he quotes a portion of the story, one of the best parts of the story, so it's so cool that he did that. The part that ends with, "Damn it, Ginger, why didn't you tell me you weren't people?" I actually started my thesis with the very beginning of like the introduction, I think. Yeah, starts with the precursor dream and configuration of the North Shore that happens just before that with the boy fishing. And I won't give away what happens there. But then like a page later or something, I quote this scene of "Damn it, Ginger," that he quotes here. I think it's just like a great way to leap straight into, like, you want to know what Lafferty's about, check out these two little scenes. And as I said there in the thesis, that, you know, it's kind of like in most of the rest of Lafferty's fiction, you take the dream logic of these little dream sequences and the strange turns they take and just move that out into waking reality. And that's kind of the rest of Lafferty's fiction, although he does do a handful more actual dream sequences here and there. But the dream, you know, life itself becomes a strange dream sequence in a lot of ways in Lafferty. And it's so cool. Chris likened this very story and the way it works in its little plot and journey to his own journey looking for the perfect Lafferty story for his channel, story by story. It's like, oh, that's so good. Yeah, so go check these guys out and, you know, interact with their videos. And another thing that Chris at Liminal Spaces has just recently started reading is actually Gene Wolfe, and he read The Shadow of the Torturer, the first book in the Book of the Long Sun, and made a few videos trying to talk about it, even though he knows he needs the rest of the series to interpret it properly. But Virgil from Literally Books saw Chris's videos on Gene Wolfe, and Virgil's a longtime reader of Wolfe, so he was like excited about this, and he's going to engage it more in the future. But he noted that Chris is coming into Wolfe without a lot of the baggage that people bring in with all these theories about how to interpret it and different things. And it's just coming at it really fresh. And Virgil finds that exciting. And that's exactly what I'm getting out of these guys encountering Lafferty for the first time. You know, in one case, there was no reputation preceding it at all, except that it was recommended by Wolfe. You know, and in the other case, a certain kind of reputation, but just not a whole lot of framework, and just come in and like, whoa. And they're just have that fresh, like, this is strange and interesting, people should know about this type of perspective. So that's very refreshing for me as well.
Ghosts in the corner of my eyes, etch always in light.